Welcome to the program. France has been forced to admit its special forces were secretly operating in Libya after 3 agents were killed in the country. The presence of special forces isn't really a surprise, as there had been numerous indications that that was the case. More troublesome, however, are the questions it raises over France's loyalties, because the Government of National Unity, which has the backing of the international community, says that it had not been informed of these operations and now views them as a violation of sovereignty. In fact, what you're watching right now are protests against the presence of foreign forces in Libya. Joining us to discuss this today are William Jordan, a former U.S. diplomat in the Middle East, several postings there, and also Director of North African Affairs. That includes Libya at the U.S. State Department. Also joining us via Skype from the state of Washington in the U.S. is, I beg your pardon over the phone, is Faraj Al-Jari, Libyan journalist. Faraj, I want to put the first question to you. We saw those protests, we saw those pictures, people gathering in Tripoli against foreign intervention. And I want to tell you, this really reminds me of what I saw when I was in Libya at the very beginning of the uprising in 2011. One of the first things that people said is, we do not want foreign forces. Why are Libyans so vehemently opposed to having foreigners come, even if their purpose officially is to help?
Well, actually, in order to understand the situation first in Libya, we need to know that the country is under division between different groups. Those groups are located in the western part of the country and also in the eastern part. Some of the groups and armed groups, especially in the Libyan capital, are backing the Islamic extremists and those that are fighting in Benghazi and in Sirte also, whether ISIS or affiliated with Akim, Al-Qaeda, and Islamic Maghreb. So the protests that have been that were seen today in Tripoli and some parts of Misrata and Al-Zawiya, most of them were arranged by, organized by leaders of some Islamic militants who were against the Libyan army fighting terrorist groups in the eastern part of the country.
So this is an expression of the internal divisions within Libya, in particular the divisions and the fighting between the government and the Islamist militias.
Absolutely, absolutely. The fighters that are fighting in the east are supported by the militants in the west, and the place that the French soldiers were thought to be killed at witnessed a battle or a fight between the Libyan army and Islamic militia called Benghazi Defense Brigade. This militia came from the western part of the country, exactly from Misrata. It first got province from Misrata and came through Sirte, where ISIS fighters are. This brigade didn't fight ISIS in Sirte and passed all the way to the east until it reached Benghazi, where it was fought by the Libyan army. The Libyan army, we know that it has been fighting the terrorist groups in the eastern part of the country and also some western and southern areas, but mainly in the eastern part, especially Benghazi, where the city and about 90% of the city is liberated now, and most of the fighters who are affiliated or part of ISIS fled to the western part of the country. So one of the people who were talking in your report on the news report was Sami Al-Sari. He's a leader of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which is listed as a terrorist group by United Nations and by the United States, and I guess by France. Also, the brigade that was heading to the east, and it was targeted by the Libyan army and thought French soldiers were killed during this action. This brigade is also affiliated with those who attacked the U.S. Embassy in 2012. Specifically, we are talking about Ismail al-Talabi, who is...
all right, hold on. Faraj, let me interrupt you there for a second. And I need you to address this question that I asked you, which is why Libyans are so violently opposed to the intervention of foreign forces. You're telling me it's because it's only because they are the people we saw on those pictures were affiliated to those Islamist militias, or at least supporters of those militias. That's what you're saying.
Yes. And a reason of this is because of the history of the Libyan people, who are a bit sensitive with foreign interventions especially we're talking about the Italian intervention a long time ago. I mean, when it comes to the history of Libya with the Italian occupation and Omar Markan and this resistance. But this is not exactly the case this time, because those the people who are opposing the assistance France is supposed to offer or present to the Libyan army are those who are allied with Islamic militants and others who are against the values that France stands for, the Libyan political agreement that Libyans are supporting. Now, not all of the Libyans responded to the call to protest. During the past 2 days, many parties, especially the Islamic ones, were calling for Libyans to protest against what the so-called French intervention. And as we've seen, only tens or maximum 100 or 2 responded. So there is a kind of division in the Libyan street, or the Libyan people, who are exactly understand the case that there is more than intervention. There is part of the Libyan parties who are involved in the war with ISIS. They are affiliated with ISIS and affiliated with Akim, Al-Qaeda, and Islamic Maghreb. Yes.
All right, Faraj Al-Jari. Let me bring in William Jordan now. William, you've been on the set commenting on this country many times, and we've seen Libya really disintegrate over the last couple of years, ever since the fall of Muammar Gaddafi, the uprising in Libya in 2011. And the government of national unity was supposed to bring some kind of cohesion to the state, but that hasn't been the case yet.
No, not at all. Before I get to that, let me just make a real quick point about the previous part of what we've been talking about. One of the images that's been prominently displayed on the internet and in various broadcasting is showing a banner that says, in English, something along the lines of "No to French intervention" with a cross, a Christian cross. In Arabic, what's important is it says "No to French imperialism or colonialism." So I think it's a very important nuance to bear in mind in terms of understanding, the sensitivities, at least of many Libyans, as far as what the perception of France's intervention or military involvement might be.
Yeah, because Faraj was saying that the people who are protesting here are just a narrow subsection of the Libyan population. But what you're telling us that there is actually a widespread feeling that they don't want foreigners meddling in their affairs.
Well, again, there is the narrative out there that says that it was because of the Western intervention in support of the uprising against Muammar Gaddafi, as Gaddafi was, let's be honest, let's remember this correctly, was moving to mow down and oppress, in a very violent way, those people who had challenged his rule in early 2011. There are those Libyans who, looking back on everything, since Gaddafi fell, have said, this is largely because the West betrayed us. The West had us throw out Gaddafi, but then it didn't do enough to help us rebuild and, or in fact, build a real state, to replace it. And I think that, in terms of the inevitable, under the circumstances, descent into political division, as well as the proliferation of all of these militias. I mean, the real challenge has been to try to find some kind of center of gravity in Libya around which Libyans can coalesce, around which Libyans can look to form some kind of a core of a new national spirit, a new national unity.
And that was supposed to be the national unity government.
That was supposed to be the national unity government, but again, what we're talking about, and I make a lot of comparisons to what's happening in Syria. The problem in Libya, just as with Syria, is you have a very weak basic foundation for a nation state to begin with. When Libya was
Which is a legacy of the Gaddafi era.
No, it goes even before that. I mean, it's a legacy of the fact that when Libya, prior to the Italian colonization of Libya, there really was no core to speak of. You had Libya divided into 3 or more separate regions. And while, people may have interacted with one another, at the exception of the Ottoman sort of period of overrule, when Libya moved in, that was the first time that all of these parts of the country today were brought together.
Right.
And after World War II, after the Italians lost World War II and they were forced to give the Libyan colony up, it fell to the United Nations to try to put together a country, which ended up being the monarchy under King Idris. Well, Libya very much was divided into these three different parts. I mean, Idris came from the eastern part, around what's called Cyrenaica, and focused on Benghazi and Tobruk.
Which is why the first thing the rebels did in 2011 when they rose up against Muammar Gaddafi was show portraits of Idris, and they wanted to bring the king back because
right. Well, they wanted that was one idea about trying to do it. Ironically, again, as with Syria, the one person who sort of created this contemporary Libyan identity was a dictator of the worst type. And what he did, though, was he didn't just create sort of the shell of a nation state, as arguably happened with Hafez al-Assad in Syria, but he created a sort of a one-off, unique sort of state of the masses that only he could control, only he could explain, and only he ultimately wielded the power to be able to keep everybody else into line. So when he was overthrown, I mean, Libya had nothing to fall back on, and there was no real tradition beyond sort of loose tribal traditions for any kind of political
and that's what
deal
we're seeing playing out today. Armed tribes, armed factions, many of which are pursuing a very narrow agenda of protecting their city, their region, their people.
Well, what's happened is that whatever traditional bonds of tribal loyalty, which might have been based on clan and might have been very regionally based, have been swept away by those who have the weapons. So as somebody in Algiers, which was my last posting, was warning in 2011 as all of this was happening, he had been an ambassador, an Algerian ambassador in Libya. What was basically happening was that with the Western intervention, in his view, very Algerian point of view on this, you were creating conditions where what limited inbuilt native structures could put the country back together were being swept aside because the armed conflict among these different militia groups was taking primacy. And it was ultimately going to be those who had the weapons. It was going to be more like Somalia, where those who had the weapons, those who could impose the immediate control, those who could secure the gains, whether it was oil resources or other things, were going to be the ones who won and were going to be the ones who dictated the terms of an ultimate political settlement.
And Faraj, I'm sure you can hear what William Jordan is saying. Basically, those who have the military means to impose their will be the ones writing the next chapter of Libya's history. Now, I want to get back to the special forces. Special forces of several countries. It's not just France. It's also the U.S. It's also Britain. They, of course, are trying to tilt things in favor of the groups that they view as being less dangerous. Who are they fighting alongside, as far as you know?
Actually, the international community is working in Libya, as we said before, on two different levels. One level supporting the national accord government and the political dialogue and the political agreement. On the other hand, they are supporting more realistic and more on the ground the forces that are fighting extremism and the two regions of the country, east and west, and some parts of the south, of course. But the issue is the forces that are fighting extremism, they are not on the same page. I mean, there's a lot of disagreement and dispute between them. Mainly, we are talking about the Libyan National Army in the east and the Misrata militants in the west. The reports, Western reports, showed 4 months ago that there's special forces from UK and from the United States fighting alongside with the Misrata militants in the western part of the country. While, as we see from yesterday and the previous reports about the French role in Libya, it is supporting the Libyan National Army. And to give a more background about those two parties, the party who is on the side of the Misrata militants who are fighting now in Sirte, not in Benghazi, are those who were accused to support or be affiliated with those extremists in 2014 and 2013, when the Libyan army was fighting those groups, and we're talking about extremist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, while those militants who are fighting Al-Qaeda and ISIS now were saying that there was no ISIS in Libya, and there was clashes and fights in Benghazi, and assassinations in Benghazi were about more than 500 officers of the Libyan army were assassinated by ISIS. So these groups, at the first, they were allies with ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and then now they are fighting them because they are trying to show to the Western or the international community that, see, we want democracy, we want human rights, and we are fighting terrorism, which is not the case last year. On the other hand, the Libyan army have been fighting those groups and standing against them since 2012 and up to now without getting any international support or at least recognition. The Libyan army in the east and also in many parts of the western parts of Libya and the south is under the legitimacy of the human House of Representatives, which is directly elected by Libyans. While those forces or militants in the western part of the country, they are kind of civilians who get weapons and who formed certain groups. Every one of them is under control of certain leader. You cannot know their shape or who they support or who they follow. But the Libyan army, we know the leadership of this army, we know the officers, and we know where they take their orders from. So they are more organized.
Faraj, I would just cut you off for a second just now. William Jordan is listening to what you're saying.
Well, I was just going to say that, the problem is really that the Libyan National Army under General Haftar in the east, while it's probably one of the most potent forces, and it is in fact under the command or working in connection with the Tobruk Parliament, which is in many ways still a legitimate political force in the country. He specifically has become something of a stumbling block, of a major obstacle to achieving the kind of national accord behind the government that the UN process helped to
he's refused to endorse the National Unity Government. He's the reason, in fact, they don't really the unity government is a unity in name only.
Now, what's happening, how I analyze a lot of what's been happening on the ground with special forces is that, for months there has been this obsession about the Islamic State building up its presence in Libya, using it increasingly as a back base and increasing sort of its position there in case things go even worse in Iraq and Syria. And so the special forces applying, the same logic that they're applying in Syria and in Iraq have been working with whoever they can in order to help fight the Islamic State. Well, it's had the inevitable consequences because you can't trust the people you think you're working with, from one day to the next. I mean, that was part of the problem that happened in Benghazi with the CIA base being attacked in 2012. And that's clearly been, I think, part of the problem with what's happened to the French Special Forces. According to most reports, the French Special Forces have been working with General Haftar in terms of trying to help his forces either against Islamic State or, generally speaking, in terms of the fighting against jihadist militias. That's a dangerous game.
Yeah.
I mean, in the absence of any kind of progress on the political front, to try to get beyond General Haftar and the obstacle he poses to promoting real unity politically in the country, you're going to have this constant problem that the special forces will be intervening and will be doing their thing in the shadows behind the scenes, but they are going to be operating in a very risky environment where they can't be sure from day to day what's going to happen, as they think they're working with people they can trust on, in their operations. So.
William Jordan, former U.S. diplomat, thank you very much. Faraj Al-Jarri, a Libyan journalist, thank you also for joining us over the phone from Washington State. And that's all the time we have for now. Do stay tuned. The headlines up next.